Good morning, everybody. Thank y'all so much for joining us with John Seahan with Goosehead Insurance. Today, we're going to talk about property insurance and real estate, and John's got some great information that's going to help y'all to be even better realtors. So, John.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. Thank y'all for joining us. As I was telling Stacy, the information that I had emailed was actually my talking points, more or less. So y'all presumably would have gotten that email from me yesterday, but I'm going to share this on the screen. Hopefully everybody can see it so that y'all can go along with me as we discuss these things. But I was going to start with flood insurance, which I think is probably appropriate given Tropical Storm Beta that affected us this past week. First thing I want to mention is that every home is in a flood zone. I hear people say all the time, "Oh, I don't need flood insurance because my house is not in a flood zone." That is simply not true. Every property is in a flood zone. The Army Corps of Engineers designates those flood zones, and some houses are simply in higher risk flood zones than others. And homes that are in high risk flood zones, the buyer, their mortgage company, their lender, assuming they have one, is going to require that they have flood insurance. If they are in a low risk flood zone, they have the option to not purchase flood insurance, but it is absolutely a good idea to have flood insurance, because if we come back over to this slide, you can see that, using Harvey as an example, there were so many thousands of homes, tens of thousands of homes that flooded, that were in low risk flood zones, that had never flooded before, and yet they did flood, and most of those people did not have flood insurance. And in that case, the best you can do is hope to get an SBA loan from the government. It is a low interest loan, but you are required to pay that back. So it's much cheaper to just carry flood insurance. There are some homeowners insurance policies now that do offer an endorsement where you can add some flood coverage to the dwelling itself. It's generally a very limited amount, maybe $50,000 at most, and it does not cover any contents. So again, the best thing to do is purchase a flood insurance policy. The cost difference between the policy and the endorsement is not that great. So you get more coverage with the flood policy, and you get coverage for your contents too. So I would absolutely advise that you do that, that your clients do that. There are two types of policies. The most common is the policies backed by the National Flood Insurance Program. There are a number of insurance carriers that write these policies. They are all through the NFL, but the coverages and premiums are all the same. It doesn't matter where you get it. Those policies backed by the National Flood Insurance Program generally have a 30-day waiting period once you pay for the policy before coverage can go into effect, unless it is in a high-risk flood zone and the buyer's lender is requiring that they carry flood insurance. In that case, they can get flood coverage immediately, or at least on the closing date. The best thing to do, given the fact that most properties are in low risk flood zones and therefore flood insurance would not be required, is to have your buyer purchase flood insurance during the option period, well before the closing date. That way the coverage can go into effect by the time the closing happens, or at least shortly thereafter. If for some reason the closing falls through and the client's already purchased the flood insurance policy, then the policy can be canceled and their money would be refunded to them. They are not going to just be out that money entirely indefinitely. As I mentioned here, Goosehead actually has the carriers that, a lot of the carriers that offer the National Flood Insurance Program policy. So we can offer that. Certainly, we do have a private market flood insurance carrier through a company called Neptune Flood. It does offer some coverage benefits, specifically replacement cost for contents and loss of use coverage. If you are forced out of your home and it's uninhabitable due to a flood loss, Neptune Flood would pay up to $7,500 for your clients to stay in a hotel while their home is repaired or rebuilt. The National Flood Insurance Program does not offer loss of use coverage at all, nor do they offer replacement cost for contents, which means that they would depreciate the value of your client's contents, so they may not necessarily get their contents that were lost in the flood. The other thing, the policy from Neptune only has a 10-day waiting period, so you can get that into effect much quicker than you can the policies through the National Flood Insurance Program. And in terms of price, I will say Neptune, in a lot of cases, is not that much more than the policies through the NFIP. And in some cases, I've seen them actually be less, even with those extra coverages. So it's never a bad idea to take a look at that option as well. The next thing kind of goes hand in hand with flood insurance would be Texas Windstorm Insurance Association. So I'll switch that now. Following Hurricane Ike in 2008, TWIA kind of changed up their requirements a little bit. So let me back up. Changes to existing structures and certainly new construction have the requirement now that a windstorm certification be obtained anytime these changes are being made or a home is being constructed. The changes that you might find being required to have a windstorm certification include, but are not limited to, a new roof, new siding, new windows, or anything in general that changes the structural footprint of the home. TWIA would require that a windstorm certification be done. I have seen cases where people got a TWIA policy and did not have the windstorm certification in place. And I was advised by an underwriter that those people could have their claims denied if they do have a claim and Windstorm finds out that they don't have the certification. I'm not saying that that would necessarily be what would happen. It is just a possibility. So if you have any clients that are in an area where a TWIA policy is required, or they're getting one because, you need to make sure that if they're doing anything to change the structure, that they have a windstorm certified engineer do this certification. That just takes out all of the potential issues.
Where do we find a windstorm engineer?
There is a list on their website. I don't know if the general public has access to that. Actually, you know what? Stacy, would it be okay if I change screens real quick? Or
Of course.
I'm saying it's on the windstorm website. It may actually be on the Texas Department of Insurance's website. Let's see. I tell you what, so I don't hold this up. How about I find that and then I will send that out to you guys. Would that be okay?
Perfect.
That's great. And John, would you mind explaining to everyone about the typical or traditional locations of where this would be required? You know, such
Absolutely.
like Galveston or. You know.
Yes. Actually, you're reading my mind. I was going to point that out next. Windstorm policies are generally only available in counties that border the Gulf of Mexico, all the way from the Louisiana border down to the Rio Grande Valley. In Harris County, there is a very small, even though Harris County doesn't actually border the Gulf of Mexico, there is a small area south of Interstate 10 and east of Highway 146 that borders, I guess that would be Trinity Bay. That little sliver of Harris County is subject in some cases to a Texas windstorm policy need. And I say in some cases because even though generally, historically, the Windstorm Association operated in those areas, there are some carriers now that do offer wind and hail coverage there in lieu of the Texas windstorm. So you could basically get a homeowner's policy that covers everything.
Is this the,
Sorry?
that, cause it's camera, right? So what is this?
Oh, I thought they had a question. Sorry.
Thought so too.
So there are some carriers that actually offer the wind and hail coverage down there. Personally, I like to go that route if possible because WIA is a state-backed insurance carrier. So it's government-backed. You're dealing with the state when you have a claim, and they can be slow sometimes. I mean, they'll usually get the job done appropriately, but I always like to deal with the private carrier when possible. But sometimes in terms of cost, it's better to have a homeowner's policy that does not include wind and hail coverage in conjunction with a TWIA policy and go that route. So there are the two options in that case. But again, coastal counties, anything that is bordering the Gulf of Mexico, around here, that's primarily going to be Galveston, Brazoria, and Chambers counties as well. Let's see here. Something else that TWIA has recently begun requiring in some cases, and I have to apologize, I don't have the specific cases at my disposal, but in some cases, in some areas, they do require that you have flood insurance if you also have a windstorm policy. Generally speaking, that's going to be homes that are along the beach. Galveston, like the West End, Jamaica Beach, and Bolivar, the new construction down there. If you've got a Texas windstorm policy, you are almost certainly going to have flood insurance, be it through a private market carrier or the NFIP. It doesn't matter. They are going to require that. And the reason is during Hurricane Ike, a lot of people didn't have flood insurance, and some people that had flood insurance didn't have windstorm policies. And there was damage to their homes. And so if you tried to claim wind damage, TWIA could come back, and they did come back to people in some cases and say, well, it wasn't truly wind damage. The wind pushed the water up into your home. That's flood. And they didn't have flood, so they weren't covered. But then there were cases where people were trying to file flood claims, and they were saying, no, the wind pushed the water up in here. It's not truly rising water. And so the flood would deny that claim. Having a windstorm policy and having a windstorm policy and a flood policy together eliminate that issue. So somebody's going to pay one way or another. That wasn't always the case. It is something new. So just, let your clients know if you're buying a beach house down there on the coast, you're probably going to have flood insurance, but even if you don't have to have it, it is absolutely a good idea that you do have it anyway. And let's see here. The next thing I wanted to talk about, Stacy had actually brought this to my attention. Vacant homes. Evidently, there is a lot of confusion about vacancies and what that entails. And I think that holds true with insurance agents too. But I want to mention right off the bat, actually the last paragraph on this page, it is very important to note that most of the time when someone is buying a new home, if they don't move in immediately, that is not considered a vacancy. Generally, if you move into the home, occupy the home within 30 days, the home is considered occupied. And that ties into the fact that, looking above, most carriers will allow a home to be vacant for up to 30 days. Some it's 45, some it's 60, but generally speaking, 30 days is the cutoff. If you're on vacation for a couple of weeks, you're not going to be there, whatever, doesn't matter, it's still considered occupied. But in some of these cases above here, if you're between tenants for an extended period of time, if you've moved from one city or one state to another city or state, and the house is sitting on the market for sale, right now, fortunately, that's not really been an issue because houses are selling so quickly. But it wasn't always like that, and it won't always be like that. Some houses just will simply sit unoccupied for a while. Probate is another circumstance where you may have a house sitting unoccupied for a while. Most homeowners policies, again, they're not going to cover after 30 days. Some of them have what's called a vacancy clause, where you can add that to the policy, and it essentially re-rates the type of policy, if you will. There's a surcharge that applies when you have a vacancy clause added, but it enables the customer, or the owner, I should say, to have at least some coverage for the house. It may be on a more limited scale than what they had on their homeowner's policy, but they would not necessarily have to obtain a separate policy for a vacant home. In some cases, their insurance carrier simply doesn't have that option. If they want to truly protect themselves and their property, the next best thing to do, cancel the policy that you have in place or that they have in place and get a true vacant home policy. Again, they're more limited in terms of the scope of what they cover, and they don't generally cover any contents, but again, if they're vacant, contents probably aren't going to be a big deal anyway. But just so you guys are aware, we at Goosehead, we do have several carriers that offer the vacant home policy. They're not cheap, but it's better than paying for your homeowner's insurance, having a big loss, and then having it denied because you didn't have the proper type of policy in place. So just something to consider. I know a lot of you folks, again, you're going to be representing buyers, and if they're concerned, maybe they're not going to move in for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, that's okay. That's perfectly fine. That's within the parameters of what's allowed. They can purchase the home, and as long as they move in within 30 days, the house will still be covered appropriately.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Um, Sometimes when you find those old houses that are on a lot and say the family owned it and nobody's living there anymore, and it's really hard to get those old houses with vacant insurance. Sometimes you can't get it at all.
That may be. I would say in that case, if it's an older home, like down in the Heights area of Houston, let's take that for
That's a great example.
example.
1958,
Exactly.
grandma just died, and so there's probably no insurance on the house, and
Right.
it hasn't been rehabbed. So
In a situation like that, I would look to a carrier called Foremost. They will pretty much write anything you can think of. Again, it's not going to be cheap, especially if it's not been renovated or rehabbed. If it's mostly original stuff, galvanized plumbing. Uh, the one thing that could potentially be a problem is if a home has aluminum wiring. There are very, very, very few carriers that will take homes with aluminum wiring. I believe Foremost will. Like I said, they'll pretty much take everything, but you're gonna pay for it too. They're not, that type of policy is not cheap. Older homes are generally more expensive than newer homes anyway. But when you add a vacancy to it and the lack of updates, all those things are going to come into play. It is possible to get them insured though. And again, I would say Foremost would be the first one I would look at. Wellington, second. They're another one. Their underwriting guidelines are very loose. They'll take pretty much anything short of a house having aluminum wiring. I have another carrier that I would have generally looked at too for something like that, but they recently stopped writing houses built prior to 1999. I don't know why. So that takes them out of play for now. But good news is I've got Foremost and Wellington. So I write policies with both. So I can help with something like that for sure.
thank you.
Absolutely. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did.
Thank you. And let's see here. The last thing I wanted to mention, I know I hadn't told Stacy about this, and so y'all may not be ready for it, but I did include this printout in the email that I had sent out yesterday, and I just wanted to go over it briefly. There are 4 types of homeowners policies that you generally see in Texas: the HOA, HOA plus, HO3, and HOB. The HOA and HOA plus are the most basic policies, offering the most limited amount of coverage and the most limited type of coverage. And good news with that is they are cheaper in most cases, though generally not a lot cheaper. But if you've got a client with a DTI issue and price is absolutely paramount, you can look at the HOA or HOA plus as a low cost option to help at least get them in the house, get that loan closed, get it sold, and then they can change it down the road if they so choose. But again, it is the most limited. And really, you don't see a lot of carriers anymore even offering either of those policies. We have one carrier that did offer the HOA and HOA plus, but being that they're just not a good policy, they actually stopped offering those. So you don't see them much anymore, but they are still out there and available as needed. The HO3 and HOB policies are the most common, most comprehensive type of policy that you would see or that you would find. They're very similar to each other, but generally an HOB in some cases may include some of these optional water damage coverages that I've listed about 3/4 down the page, though that's not always the case. They may not necessarily always be included. Sometimes you have to add them a la carte style, but whether you get an HO3 or an HOB, I always recommend that a customer get these water damage coverages if they don't want them, or if cost is an issue and we have to take them out again to make the insurance work for the DTI, so be it. But in another life, before I came to Goosehead, I worked for my father at his Allstate agency for 8.5 years, and they didn't offer these coverages. They weren't included on the policy. And I saw many, many times where people filed a claim and it got denied because it fell under one of these 3 water damage categories, which wasn't covered. So now that I've seen that, and now that I have access to carriers that offer it, knowing how much money it can save your clients if they opt to carry these coverages, I always recommend that they include them. But again, like I said, if cost is an issue, it's not necessary that they be added at that time. And let's see here. I think that's really about it. Just a little bit about me, so you guys know. I've been in the insurance business for, let's see, this is my 16th year. I've been doing it basically since I got out of college. It's all I've ever done. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. I've got a lot of experience. I've seen a lot of things, know a lot of things, and have access to 20 or 25 different carriers. And all of them are A-rated, solid carriers that we can consider for your clients. If there's ever something that I don't have an answer to, I'm always happy to get answers to for you guys. And the carriers themselves are always happy to answer questions too. So,
John, if I could add, since I've been working with John, he is a great resource when you have questions about insurance. I've run into some situations and it's just like, I don't know what to do. It's like, I'll call John and John will tell me what we need to do. So he is an excellent resource. And also keep him in mind for your clients during their option period, to get a quote for, and see if flood insurance is going to be required for the house that they're thinking about buying.
I would recommend, like Stacy said, doing all that during the option period. A lot of times, frankly, people you almost have to force them to do it. They don't want to.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you run into situations, again, going back to the DTI, where insurance is, you're operating on a very thin margin. And if you wait till the last minute and you find out that, hey, this homeowner's insurance isn't quite going to work like we were thinking it might, we've got to do something. It's better to know that 30 days from closing than 3 days from closing.
Yes.
I would absolutely recommend the sooner the better, especially for the flood insurance, if nothing else, because again, if they're in a low risk flood zone and they're going to be subject to that 30-day waiting period, it's better to get it during the option period, because you're going to have time to get that thing paid for and in effect by closing. I know some people that bought houses right before Harvey, and they had bought flood insurance, but they waited till too close to closing to buy it. So the flood insurance went into effect after they closed, but between the time that they closed and the time that the insurance went into effect, Harvey happened. And so here they are in a house, been in there for a week, 2 weeks, maybe, and $50,000 worth of flood damage. And if they'd have just bought that policy 2 weeks earlier, they still would have flooded, but they would have had coverage. So the option period is absolutely the best time to do that. And I'm always happy to answer any insurance related questions you guys have. Even if it's not, you don't have a referral, that it doesn't matter. If you have a question, just let me know and I will be happy to answer it. If I don't have the answer, like the question that I'm going to be looking for, I will get the answer for you, and I will do it just as quickly as I can. I'm not going to hold your closing up. We'll do anything we can to help you guys.
Yeah, considering talking about flood insurance, is there anywhere I can go? Because I know there's a 500-year and the 100-year zones, and then it breaks those down into a bunch of different categories with your letters and all that. Is there anywhere I can go to look and see what all that means and what I can present my customer with if they have questions as far as like what the tiers, I guess, of flood insurance?
I don't honestly know if there is a publicly available site that has some of the information that we have. So for instance, if you call me and say, hey, I've got this client looking at this house and here's the address, can you tell me if it's in a flood zone or what flood zone it's in? On our end, it doesn't break it down into the 100-year flood zone or 500-year flood zone. It breaks it down into an alphabetized zone.
Okay.
So X is going to be the most common low risk flood zone around here, at least.
Yeah.
So if it's in a flood zone X, chances are it's not going, the client is not going to be required to carry flood insurance. There are some exceptions to that. I don't want to get into the weeds of this and complicate things, but generally if it's in a flood zone X, they're not going to be required to have flood insurance. Flood zone AE is the most common high risk flood zone that you'll find in this area, at least. And as you go closer to the coast, V or VE is the two most common types of high risk flood zones.
Okay.
There is a website. You asked me now, and I can't remember off the top of my head.
Is that the FEMA?
That's, yes, the FEMA website. It does show color-coded, at least it used to. I don't know if it still does, but it showed color-coded areas and broke the flood zones down in that way, who was in a high-risk flood zone and who was not in a high-risk flood zone. But that website was always a little cumbersome to me to try to find, in some cases, exactly where a house lie within a certain flood zone. So frankly, I never used it. I always relied on the flood websites that we have to tell me exactly.
I have another question.
Yes, ma'am.
Is the price of the flood insurance based on being in a flood zone and not being in a flood zone? Or is it just the same?
Generally, yes, it's dependent on that. With the NFIP or FEMA-backed policies, if you are in a flood zone X, then no matter what carrier you get that policy from, the price would be the same so long as you have the same coverages and deductibles from one carrier to the next. It's anything from FEMA and the NFIP is fixed. If you're looking at an AE or V or VE zone, that depends on the elevation of the house in relation to the base flood elevation. So in other words, how high above the base flood elevation the house lies. If there have been any claims in the past, that can have an effect on those. If you are looking at a house in an AE or V or VE zone, you are almost always going to, the customer, I should say, is almost always going to have to provide a flood elevation certificate from an engineer, because there is information on that document that is necessary in order to even quote somebody in those zones. So if I went into, say, Progressive's flood quoting website and I saw that someone was in an AE zone, I'm almost always going to have that elevation certificate before it will even allow me to proceed past the point of determining what zone it's in. So it just depends. Again, X zones, they're fixed. They're going to be the same pretty much regardless. But it's those high risk zones where it's a little more nuanced. So yeah, if you've got someone looking at a house in a high risk zone, make sure that they are able to get an elevation certificate from the sellers, or that they're aware they're probably going to have to pay for one. They're usually about $400, $400 to $500. The private market flood carrier I was mentioning, Neptune Flood, they don't require an elevation certificate in most cases. So if the client doesn't want to pay to get the elevation certificate, or if closing is happening within 2 weeks and they need something, within that 10-day time frame, we can do a policy with Neptune Flood. It's probably going to cost more in that case. I mean, I almost guarantee you it will, but it saves them the trouble of having to get an engineer and the cost of getting that certificate. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Certainly. Anyone else have any more questions?
I just wanted to point out to most of my agents know this, but on the MLS, when you're in the property information sheet, if you'll just click on flood map, it spells out pretty much what zone it's in. But even with that being said, it's still important to advise your clients to talk to a insurance company during their option period to determine.
That's good to know. I actually did not know that was in the MLS myself.
Yeah, we've got a tab that shows exactly where the house is, and then it tells you flood code description, such as Zone X, an area that is determined to be outside the 100 and 500 year floodplains.
Ah, okay. Well, that's good to know. Thank you.
It is. It's good general knowledge, but still, I would have my clients during their option period pick up the phone and talk to the insurance carrier.
Absolutely. I mean, it might tell you what zone it's in, but it doesn't mean you don't need flood insurance.
Exactly. Exactly.
See, I learned something new today too.
All right, guys, does anybody else have any other questions? Let me unmute a few of you. I think I've got some of y'all muted.
That covers it.
Steve, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think that pretty much covered everything, all my questions.
Okay. Did everybody get the email that I sent yesterday morning? If you have any other questions, if you think of them later, you're more than welcome to call or email me, and I'll be happy to address those.
John, thank
I
you
didn't
very
get the email,
much.
but Stacy sent me a link to it. So
Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay.
Okay. Well, John, thank you so much for taking time this morning.
My pleasure.
And I'm sure we'll be talking to you soon.
All right, sounds good. Everybody, y'all have a